Hey guys, tonight we begin with a tale that is as bizarre as it is gentle to fall asleep to, so dim your lights, grab a blanket, and settle into a chair because we are going to drift into the strangest corners of Roman history. Now before you get too comfortable, remember that history was written by people who thought it would be perfectly reasonable to throw elaborate parties while political chaos quietly brewed in the background, and sometimes the chaos smelled faintly of manure and perfume at the same time. And in this case, the Chaos King wearing the finest silk robes and a crown that probably cost more than a small village. Our protagonist is Elagabalus, who ruled Rome from 218 to 222 AD. He came into power as a teenager, which is always a tricky age for ruling an empire and for general sanity. Imagine being 14 or 15 and suddenly deciding the fate of millions of people while simultaneously trying to figure out how to keep your sandals tied. Of course, he had advisors and family who probably whispered in his ears constantly. But that rarely stops teenage rulers from doing exactly what they feel like doing, which in this case was everything. Elagabalus was called an emperor, but that title was stretched to include behaviors that modern historians politely describe as eccentric. He was devoted to the Syrian sun god Elagabal, which he insisted must be placed above all the old Roman gods, which made for a lot of awkward conversations in temples that smelled faintly of incense and scandal. He was also very fond of extravagant meals, elaborate parties, and demonstrating absolute disregard for the dignity of the Senate. One of his most famous acts, which would eventually make senators very nervous, was the elevation of his horse Incitatus to positions of authority. The horse had a marble stall that was reportedly more luxurious than most Roman homes, a jewel-encrusted collar, and servants to tend to its every need. Elagabalus did not stop there. He insisted that senators come to pay homage to the horse and even kiss its hooves, which they did with trembling lips and forced smiles, because rebellion in that moment would have been highly unwise. It is important to picture these senators in their toga robes in the hot Roman sun trying to be respectful to a horse that probably thought about nothing except oats and the occasional nap. Of course, Elagabalus did not stop at pampering animals. He had a tendency to escalate social awkwardness into life or death situations. According to contemporary accounts, he would organize spectacles in the arena where senators and nobles could be made to look foolish and sometimes worse. On one particular occasion, around 300 senators were thrown into the arena for what was described at the time as insulting the holy pony. The spectacle was meant to cement authority, but also to amuse the emperor, which is not necessarily a great political strategy when your life is still in the hands of the people who may or may not enjoy your jokes. You can imagine the murmurs in the streets and the mild panic among guards who probably thought they were signing up for normal duties like standing at gates and not supervising mass humiliation. Elagabalus had a curious habit of merging religion, politics, and personal whim in ways that made him unpredictable to even the most hardened courtiers. He would host dinner parties where the main guest of honor might be a sacred relic or a friend who had done absolutely nothing noteworthy just to watch the chaos unfold. Sometimes he would dress in attire that defied all expectations for an emperor, wearing what he called the garments of a priest of the sun god, which probably confused every visitor and domestic staff member simultaneously. Guests at these events were expected to admire everything without complaint, and anyone failing to do so might find themselves reassigned to the arena, seating as a mild suggestion of what displeasure might entail. Despite all the chaos and mismanagement, Elagabalus was not particularly tall or imposing physically, which is probably fortunate for an emperor who ruled by whim rather than strategy. His personality was described as flamboyant, excessive, and entirely unconcerned with how history might judge him, which makes for a very relaxed bedtime story and a very tense few years in Roman political life. He had a taste for ritual and ceremony so extreme that modern historians struggle to explain whether it was spiritual fervor or just a teenage desire for attention elevated to the level of law. Religious festivals could last days and often involved the displacement of entire neighborhoods to make space for parades, animals, and exotic dancers, because why not double down on spectacle when your advisors are too terrified to intervene? Now it is worth noting that the emperor's guards were supposed to ensure his safety. But even they eventually realized that constant exposure to absurdity might be hazardous to health or sanity. They watched as he combined sacred ritual with political theater and personal caprice, often in ways that endangered everyone involved, including themselves. And yet for months, he remained in power, immune to serious consequences, partly because the Romang People were too accustomed to eccentric rulers. And partly because anyone brave enough to challenge him could be quite literally thrown into the arena. By now we can see that his reign was a continuous exercise in balancing fear, amusement, and utter confusion. And just when it seemed that no spectacle could top the lavish pampering of a horse or mass humiliation of senators, Elagabalus had one final surprise in store. One morning, his guards quietly gathered in the palace chambers where the young emperor was attending to his morning ritual in a setting that was entirely inappropriate for state business. The story goes that they approached with a mixture of awe, fear, and practicality, and within a short while the city would awaken to news that no one had expected. The sun rose on Rome and the streets were calm, but inside the palace the fate of an emperor who had treated a horse as pope and played games with the lives of hundreds of senators was being quietly sealed. And in that moment one young emperor realized that absolute power can sometimes have consequences even when it is wielded with the complete confidence of a teenager who believes himself invincible. Right after that shocking moment, the next day brought an unexpected twist in Rome that no one could have predicted even if they had spent hours imagining the wildest possibilities in the palace. The guards had completed their task, and the emperor, who had elevated a horse to a position of holy authority and thrown hundreds of senators into an arena, was gone from the world in the quietest and most unceremonious way possible. And yet life in Rome did not pause for mourning or reflection because the machinery of empire continued to move forward as if nothing had happened. Markets opened at dawn, and street vendors called out their wares in a rhythm older than the empire itself. And yet behind closed doors, senators whispered nervously about what might come next, because the absurdity of the previous reign lingered like the smell of incense that never quite left the palace corridors. Elagabalus left behind a legacy that was equal parts confusion, amusement, and genuine terror, and people debated endlessly whether his reign should be remembered as a tragic accident of youth or a deliberate performance art piece on the fragility of political power. His horse Incitatus remained a peculiar figure in memory, if not in life, and the senators who had survived the arena whispered about the strange golden hooves in the marble troughs and the jewel-encrusted collar that had once commanded their obedience. And it is worth pausing here to imagine what it must have felt like for a man who had devoted years of his life to the study of law and protocol to be asked to bow to a horse and kiss its feet. It is a scenario that feels both hilarious and slightly uncomfortable at the same time, which makes it perfect for late-night reflection. As the months passed, the city gradually adapted to the new emperor, who was less flamboyant and slightly less terrifying, but who carried the invisible burden of the previous reign, like a shadow no one could quite shake. Citizens would walk past the palace and murmur stories about the young ruler who had treated a horse as a priest and forced senators into mortal embarrassment while guards watched silently. These stories became part of the culture of whispered amusement and mild dread that surrounded the imperial family, and they were told to children with a careful emphasis on the ridiculous, so that sleep might be coaxed without nightmares. And yet the memory of the 300 senators who had faced the arena remained, a quiet lesson in the dangers of indulgence and of allowing whimsy to override wisdom. Meanwhile, the palace itself bore witness to the subtle aftermath of a teenage emperor who had thought rules were suggestions and protocol was a kind of obstacle course designed for fun. Courtiers cleaned out rooms that had been transformed into elaborate shrines for the sun god or stables for pampered horses. And slowly the scent of incense faded, leaving behind only the faintest echo of extravagant taste and unchecked ambition. And in quiet corners officials would compare notes about the bizarre choices made by the late emperor and shake their heads with a kind of tired amusement that suggested perhaps human history was nothing more than a series of increasingly ridiculous experiments in authority. Elagabalus had also left behind a collection of personal letters and ceremonial instructions that seemed to exist in a world entirely disconnected from reality. The letters contained detailed descriptions of outfits for festivals, suggestions for meals that included exotic animals, and careful guidance on which senators should be reminded to bow and which ones should be allowed to nod politely. Scholars later found these documents and marveled at the level of detail given to minor ceremonies and overlooked the underlying message, which was that power can be absolute and yet utterly frivolous at the same time. These artifacts became essential reading for anyone studying the peculiarities of adolescence applied to the governance of an empire, and they provided a kind of darkly amusing bedtime reading for generations. Even the common people could not entirely escape the reach of the late emperor's eccentricities because stories traveled fast and imaginations ran wilder than any parade he could have organized. People whispered about midnight rituals involving animals adorned with jewels and priests who carried out instructions that seemed more designed for spectacle than devotion. Bakers spoke quietly about the extravagant orders for feasts that required ingredients from every corner of the empire, and storytellers wove narratives that blended the real with the absurd. And in these narratives, Elagabalus became larger than life, not because he had ruled effectively, but because he had lived vividly and unpredictably in a way that left a mark both terrifying and oddly comforting to those who enjoyed hearing about people who made the world slightly stranger. By the time the next festival rolled around, the city had become accustomed to the idea that emperors could be unpredictable and that power might be wielded with a sense of theater rather than efficiency. Guards were trained to expect chaos in subtle forms, and senators perfected their expressions of polite admiration for things that defied logic. And yet the shadow of the holy horse lingered in the palace corridors and in the collective imagination. It was a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful figures in history are remembered not for conquests or legislation, but for their ability to blur the line between devotion and absurdity. And just when historians thought the tale of Elagabalus might settle into the annals of curious anecdotes, a new discovery in the imperial archives threatened to pull the city back into the peculiar orbit of his imagination. Hidden documents described an even stranger series of events during the final months of his reign, involving secret midnight ceremonies and bizarre gifts for the most influential senators. These documents suggested that the emperor's whims had not been random, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to redefine authority itself in ways that would make every observer question what was sacred and what was merely entertaining. The city waited in hushed expectation as scholars debated the implications, and the shadows of the past seemed to lengthen across the palace floors in anticipation of revelations that no one was quite prepared to fully understand. The hidden documents revealed a side of Elagabalus that even the most eccentric accounts had only hinted at, and it made the city feel like it was waking up from a dream, only to realize the dream had left traces in every corner of daily life. Scholars pored over the parchments with a mixture of amusement and bafflement, because they described rituals involving animals that had been carefully trained to perform gestures of reverence, and tables laden with offerings so extravagant that palace kitchens had surely run out of space for ordinary utensils. The emperor had apparently believed that these performances would impress the gods, or perhaps simply remind everyone watching that he was in control of the world, and the world itself must bow to his imagination. And although it is difficult to picture a teenager orchestrating such chaos, it seems that Elagabalus had perfected the art of commanding attention through spectacle while simultaneously alienating anyone who tried to offer sensible advice. The rituals themselves involved intricate choreography that might have been beautiful if they had been part of a play rather than acts of state. Animals in ceremonial garb moved through the palace halls with an air of solemnity, and attendants whispered instructions that often contradicted one another, leaving the scene both confusing and hypnotic. Scholars later speculated that the emperor may have been attempting to create a new religion in which devotion and absurdity coexisted as equals, and that in doing so he had transformed the palace into a stage for the divine comedy of imperial authority. Residents of Rome whispered quietly about servants who had to memorize the precise gestures required to honor both the sun god and the emperor himself, and the memory of these lessons lingered long after the young ruler had passed from the world. Meanwhile, the Senate tried to recover from the humiliations that had become part of the daily routine under Elagabalus. Many senators spent hours practicing expressions of polite astonishment and gestures of reverence so that they would not incur the wrath of either god or emperor in case he returned unexpectedly for a ceremonial inspection. Those who had survived the arena were particularly careful, and the entire body seemed to have developed a language of subtle nods and exaggerated bows that could convey both respect and silent despair at the same time. It is remarkable to think that a single teenager had managed to turn a government into a theater of perpetual tension while still maintaining an image of divine purpose and personal whim that made rebellion nearly impossible to consider. But the story does not end with ceremonies and surviving senators. The emperor's personal habits were equally strange and became a part of legend in their own right. Elagabalus reportedly spent hours observing the behavior of his animals, taking meticulous notes and occasionally inviting important visitors to witness the rituals. He was fascinated by the way the horse moved, by the way the dog tilted its head, and by the way birds appeared to respond to music played on delicate instruments. It was as if he were studying the universe through the lens of entertainment and devotion simultaneously, and it left a lasting impression on everyone who had to participate in the proceedings, whether they liked it or not. Of course, no discussion of Elagabalus would be complete without mentioning his taste for gifts, which was as extraordinary as his ceremonies. Gold cups encrusted with jewels were distributed to friends and enemies alike, and some senators reported receiving items so elaborate they could not be used for any practical purpose. He seemed to derive pleasure from the act of giving more than from the use of the objects themselves, as if the gesture of abundance could assert his authority more effectively than laws or edicts. Citizens watched from the streets and marketplaces as palaces glimmered with the reflection of sun on gold and gemstones, and perhaps wondered how a teenager could inspire both admiration and dread simultaneously without ever raising a sword. And yet, despite all this extravagance and ritual, the young emperor was surprisingly fragile physically and emotionally. Contemporary sources suggest he could be prone to sudden exhaustion and mood swings that left attendants tiptoeing around him at all hours. It is likely that the combination of extreme devotion to ritual and unrelenting attention to spectacle contributed to a sense of both invincibility and vulnerability that made his reign unpredictable. Those close to him had to anticipate whims that might involve ceremonial dressings or bizarre punishments, and the tension created by this environment became a defining feature of life in the palace. The hidden documents also hinted at private conversations and moments of reflection in which Elagabalus mused on the responsibilities of power and the obligations of divinity. In these moments, he seemed almost human, which makes the rest of the story feel even more surreal because it was a teenager who combined mortal uncertainty with godlike authority in a way that produced both laughter and unease. Observers remarked that he could switch from playful amusement to solemn intensity without warning, and that the palace became a place where emotion and spectacle were inseparable and where the line between devotion and performance was constantly shifting. And just as the scholars were beginning to understand the extent of his peculiar genius, another startling detail emerged from the archives. It suggested that the emperor had been planning one final act of ceremonial absurdity that would have eclipsed even the pampering of his horse and the public humiliation of senators. The nature of this act was cryptic, but references to midnight processions, animals wearing crowns, and an audience of the most powerful men in Rome suggested a combination of theatricality and personal whim that was entirely unprecedented. The anticipation of discovering exactly what this plan entailed sent ripples through both the academic community and the collective imagination of the city, and it seemed that even years after his death, the shadow of Elagabalus still held sway over the minds of those who studied him. The revelation of the emperor's final plan caused both amusement and unease because it was impossible to imagine how a teenager could orchestrate events on such a scale without leaving chaos in his wake. Scholars speculated endlessly about what might have occurred if he had survived, and the city waited with quiet curiosity as details of his life continued to trickle out from obscure corners of the archives. It seemed that every time someone thought they understood Elagabalus, something new appeared that reminded them that he had lived according to his own rules, and that the ordinary laws of caution, protocol, and dignity did not apply to him in the slightest. And yet it was this disregard for convention that made him so fascinating to both historians and casual observers alike, because here was a figure who could combine danger, absurdity, and devotion all in one slender teenage frame. Elagabalus' household staff recounted stories of mornings when he would summon the entire palace to watch the sun rise over the city while performing rituals that involved dancing flames and carefully arranged altars. No one was allowed to leave until he was satisfied that the ceremony had conveyed exactly the right mixture of reverence and spectacle. Attendants noted that he could suddenly change the order of events mid-ritual or demand that an animal take the place of a human participant without explanation or apology. It was as if he were teaching everyone around him a lesson in adaptability, patience, and humility simultaneously, and the lessons were often learned through observation rather than instruction. The emperor's taste in attire remained a topic of endless discussion because he often appeared in public, wearing garments that defied both Roman tradition and common sense. Brightly colored robes that shimmered with threads of gold were sometimes combined with accessories that belonged more to the realm of theater than empire. Observers noted that he enjoyed wearing jewelry designed to resemble the sun god and that he would sometimes walk through the palace corridors, allowing attendants to marvel at the precision of his costume and the audacity of his fashion choices. These appearances were not merely decorative because each outfit became part of the broader spectacle of authority, and the line between ceremony and self-expression blurred entirely in his presence. Despite all of this, the emperor was not immune to criticism, and he faced disapproval from senators and advisors who were unsure how to balance respect for the divine with self-preservation. Some attempted to intervene in small ways by offering suggestions about etiquette or protocol, while others quietly recorded events in hopes that posterity would better understand the combination of whimsy and severity that characterized the reign. Observers often commented that Elagabalus seemed to revel in the tension produced by these interactions, and that he enjoyed testing the boundaries of obedience with a mischievous satisfaction that made even routine duties unpredictable. The palace became a stage where the audience was constantly uncertain whether they were participating in worship, a play, or a practical joke. Even the emperor's meals were part of the spectacle, and stories suggest that no two dinners were ever alike. Guests might be presented with exotic dishes arranged to evoke religious symbolism, or with delicacies so rare that their practical consumption was nearly impossible. Servers were instructed to present food in a way that emphasized both abundance and absurdity, and guests learned quickly that polite admiration was safer than practical criticism. In many ways, these elaborate dining rituals were a microcosm of Elagabalus's approach to power-combining display ceremony and whimsy in a way that both dazzled and intimidated participants. And while it may sound entertaining, it is worth remembering that the logistics required to feed and entertain hundreds of people for days at a time were immense and often placed enormous stress on the household staff. As time passed, rumors began circulating that the emperor had grown increasingly obsessed with the concept of legacy. Despite his youth, he seemed to understand that history would remember him for his eccentricities, and he reportedly took pleasure in imagining how future generations might recount the tales of his ceremonies, his animals, and his extravagant gifts. Scholars later speculated that this awareness of posterity may have influenced many of his final acts, and that he had deliberately staged events to ensure that stories about him would persist long after his death. It is remarkable to think that someone so young could plan for history while simultaneously indulging in whimsy and spectacle on a daily basis. But perhaps the most unusual stories involved his relationship with animals, which were treated as both companions and symbols of divine favor. His horse, Incitatus, remained a central figure in court ceremonies, and other animals were brought into rituals according to precise specifications. Attendants learned to anticipate the needs of the emperor's menagerie as carefully as they learned to anticipate his moods, and it became clear that the animals were as much participants in governance as anyone else. Some historians argue that this emphasis on ritual and animal symbolism reflected an almost obsessive desire to create a sense of control over the unpredictable nature of life and power, and that the line between devotion and amusement was constantly shifting under his watchful eye. And just as scholars began to reconcile these details with what they already knew, a final set of letters was discovered describing a secret midnight procession that had been planned for the eve of the emperor's last full year. The letters hinted at costumes and rituals so extravagant and animals so carefully trained that the event might have rivaled all previous spectacles in both complexity and strangeness. The intended audience was described as the most influential men in Rome, who were expected to participate with decorum while simultaneously observing a level of absurdity that defied description. And in this way, it seemed that even in planning a final act, the emperor had not abandoned his devotion to spectacle, whimsy, or the subtle education of those around him. The letters ended abruptly with a note that suggested a last-minute change in plans and the implication that something unforeseen had occurred. The mystery of this event lingered over Rome and over the study of Elagabalus like a faint shadow stretching across the corridors of memory. Scholars and citizens alike were left to imagine what might have taken place if the emperor had survived to execute his final plan, and the anticipation of discovering the details became part of the ongoing fascination with his brief but unforgettable reign. In the stillness of the palace halls, one could almost hear the echoes of ceremonial music, the rustle of robes, and the faint jingling of jewels, as if the past itself refused to remain entirely silent. The mystery of the final midnight procession lingered over Rome and colored the way people thought about power, imagination, and the unpredictable ways in which authority could be expressed. No one could know for certain what the emperor had intended or how far his plans might have gone because the letters were incomplete and the surviving witnesses had long since passed into memory. Scholars debated endlessly whether the event had been interrupted or whether it had simply faded into obscurity, but the very act of speculation became part of the legacy of Elagabalus, whose life seemed designed to blur the boundaries between history and legend. And so the palace and the streets of Rome were haunted not by ghosts, but by the lingering echoes of an imagination that had once reshaped reality, according to the whims of a teenager who understood nothing about limits. Even years after his death, the stories of his rituals persisted among the senators who had survived, and their children and grandchildren carried tales of elaborate ceremonies and bizarre gifts that defied both sense and custom. Some recounted with a weary amusement the time they had been forced to bow to a horse and kiss its hooves in full view of the city. Others whispered about nights spent in the palace observing shadows and lights arranged with such precision that one might imagine the city itself had become a stage for the divine. And while these stories were sometimes told to inspire laughter, they also contained a quiet lesson about the fragility of social order, and the ways in which even the most carefully constructed systems can be undone by imagination, whim, and youthful exuberance. Elagabalus had also left behind a collection of personal effects that revealed a preoccupation with detail that could be both comical and unsettling. There were jeweled cups inscribed with prayers to the sun, god trays of delicacies arranged in impossible patterns, and garments embroidered with symbols that mixed divinity with personal style. Attendants remembered that the emperor took meticulous care in every aspect of presentation, from the alignment of a table to the placement of a ceremonial staff. It was as if the physical world were a reflection of his internal vision, and that every object could participate in the lessons he intended to impart through spectacle and ritual. Even those who were exhausted or terrified found themselves mesmerized by the care with which he orchestrated each element of his surroundings. The emperor's attention to animals remained a central aspect of his legacy. Incitatus the horse continued to appear in stories as a symbol of the bizarre elegance that defined the reign, and historians speculated about whether the horse had been trained to observe political gestures or whether it had simply been the focal point of a very elaborate joke. Other animals appeared in ceremonial settings with precisely timed movements, and attendants learned to anticipate both their behaviors and the whims of the emperor. It was a system of quiet order built on the foundation of absurdity, and it demonstrated the ways in which control could be exercised through spectacle rather than conventional authority. Citizens who witnessed glimpses of these events often described them as enchanting, confusing, and mildly terrifying all at once. Meanwhile, the Senate attempted to adjust to the after-effects of the reign and to navigate the complicated legacy of a ruler whose actions had been unpredictable and often humiliating. Senators who had survived the arena or the ceremonial humiliations were particularly careful to maintain outward appearances of decorum while quietly analyzing the lessons imparted by experience. They discovered that one could gain influence not only by obedience but also by subtle resistance, and that understanding the emperor's tastes and preferences could be as crucial as any formal knowledge of law or protocol. In this way, the absurdity of Elagabalus's reign became a subtle education in diplomacy and the importance of patience. Even everyday life in Rome was colored by memory of the emperor's spectacles. Merchants and citizens whispered about grand feasts and processions that had disrupted markets and neighborhoods. Children heard tales of animals wearing crowns and servants following intricate orders for hours on end. And while the stories were sometimes softened for bedtime, they retained a faint edge of anxiety, because it was clear that power could be as whimsical as it was absolute. In this way, the young emperor's influence extended far beyond the palace walls, shaping perceptions of authority, amusement, and human possibility for generations. Historians also noted the contrast between the extravagant public persona and the private moments that Elagabalus reportedly enjoyed. Accounts suggested that he could be surprisingly contemplative and reflective when alone. He reportedly observed the sunrise or sunset in quiet meditation, considered the behavior of animals in solitude, and sometimes wrote notes on philosophical topics or reflections on ritual. These moments hinted at a complexity beneath the flamboyance and suggested that even in a life dominated by spectacle, there was room for reflection, thought, and subtle intelligence. It was this combination of absurdity and introspection that made the emperor endlessly fascinating to scholars and storytellers alike. And just when it seemed that the story of Elagabalus had been catalogued completely, a fragment of a diary was discovered describing a planned ceremony, involving both senators and animals with an intricate sequence of gestures, music, and lighting. The diary ended mid-sentence, suggesting that the plan had either been interrupted or abandoned, and leaving the historians and citizens to imagine the full extent of what might have occurred. The tantalizing glimpse into an unexecuted act of ceremonial theater added yet another layer to the enduring mystery of a ruler whose life was defined by whim, spectacle, and imagination. And in the quiet of the palace halls, one could almost hear the faint echoes of ceremonial music and the rustle of robes, as if the past were gently reminding everyone that some stories refused to remain entirely silent. The fragment of the diary became a source of fascination and quiet speculation because it suggested a side of Elagabalus that was deliberate and carefully planned even amid the chaos and whimsy for which he was famous. The sequences of gestures, music, and lighting hinted at a ritual that was intended to impress both gods and humans simultaneously, and the fact that it ended abruptly left observers pondering what the final effect might have been. It was as if the young emperor had designed a performance in which time itself could be manipulated and where ordinary expectations of ceremony, protocol, and decorum were suspended in favor of something both absurd and sublime. Citizens of Rome who caught glimpses of these performances or heard accounts from attendants and senators could not help but marvel at the creativity involved while quietly hoping not to be called upon to participate directly. Attendants recalled that Elagabalus had a unique way of combining the practical with the fantastical. Tables might be set for meals that included exotic ingredients alongside carefully arranged ceremonial objects that had no practical function but contributed to the aesthetic and spiritual effect of the event. Guests were instructed to react in precise ways that demonstrated both respect and amusement, and failure to do so could result in mild but pointed social consequences. These experiences became a form of subtle education in flexibility, patience, and observation, and those who survived multiple ceremonies were considered both resilient and highly adaptable. Scholars later described the emperor's approach as a form of performance governance in which spectacle and authority were inseparable, and where whim became law for those who were present. The emperor's fascination with animals continued to dominate both public ceremonies and private reflections. Incitatus the horse remained central to many rituals, and other animals were trained to perform sequences of movements at specific times to demonstrate loyalty or reverence. Observers were instructed to watch closely and to interpret meaning in the gestures of creatures that were normally regarded as mundane. It is difficult to convey how deeply this practice affected both attendants and visiting dignitaries because it created an environment in which the line between reality and ritual was constantly shifting and where obedience and creativity existed side by side in a delicate balance. Citizens who witnessed these events often described a combination of awe, confusion, and mild terror that lingered long after the ceremonies ended. Meanwhile, senators continued to navigate the delicate aftermath of public humiliation and arena spectacles. Those who had survived both punishment and ritual now had the added responsibility of guiding the empire without provoking the memory of past whims. They learned to read subtle cues from the emperor's expressions, gestures, and choice of attire, and to anticipate events that might test their composure or their ability to participate in ceremonial absurdity. In this way, the emperor's influence extended beyond immediate spectacle to shape long-term political behavior, and social expectations and the lessons of the reign became quietly integrated into the daily functioning of the state. Even ordinary citizens could not entirely escape the reach of Elagabalus' eccentricity because rumors of grandiose ceremonies and animal parades reached every neighborhood. Storytellers adapted the tales for entertainment, often emphasizing humor or absurdity while preserving the underlying tension that the emperor could summon authority at any moment. Children learned to anticipate the unexpected, and adults quietly adjusted expectations of social norms and personal safety. In these ways, the legacy of the emperor extended far beyond the palace walls, creating a culture in which imagination, whim, and spectacle became intertwined with authority and civic awareness. The emperor's personal habits also contributed to his mystique. Observers noted that he spent hours in quiet reflection, observing animals, studying rituals, or writing notes that combined philosophy and ceremonial instruction. These moments suggested a depth of thought that was rarely apparent during public events and contributed to the sense that the emperor's reign combined unpredictability with calculated design. Attendants who witnessed both private reflection and public performance described a figure whose attention to detail could inspire both admiration and mild anxiety, and whose life seemed entirely devoted to balancing whim, authority, and legacy. One particularly unusual aspect of his reign involved the preparation of gifts for select individuals in the palace and senate. These gifts were elaborate both in design and symbolism, and often included animals arranged to represent divine principles or ceremonial motifs. Recipients were expected to interpret the significance correctly, and failure to do so could result in subtle social consequences. The exercise created a complex web of interaction in which observation and interpretation were as important as obedience and attendance, and it is remarkable to consider how effectively a teenager could orchestrate such a network of influence using only creativity, spectacle, and ritual. And then the letters hinted at yet another layer of ceremonial absurdity, suggesting a potential new hierarchy in which animals were recognized as honorary participants alongside humans. The letters described arrangements for symbolic seating decorations and precise timing of movements, intended to elevate animals to positions of visibility and influence. Scholars struggled to reconstruct the full intent because the details were fragmented, but the suggestion alone was enough to illustrate the emperor's fascination with redefining authority and the boundaries between human and divine perception. It was an approach that was both unsettling and intriguing and contributed to the enduring fascination with his reign long after his physical presence had ended. Just as historians were beginning to piece together the full extent of Elagabalus, as imaginative vision and additional fragment emerged describing the emperor as planned for a grand nocturnal procession that would combine music, costume, and ritual into an unprecedented public spectacle. The fragment ended mid-sentence and implied that the event was never completed, leaving a tantalizing mystery hanging over the city. The anticipation of what might have occurred if the emperor had survived and executed the procession created a quiet tension among scholars and citizens alike, and suggested that the imagination of a teenager could leave a mark on history that persisted far beyond a brief reign. The palace corridors seemed to echo faintly with imagined music and rustling robes, as if the past itself were reluctant to remain silent. The grand nocturnal procession remained one of the most tantalizing mysteries of Elagabalus's reign, because it hinted at a level of theatricality and ritual that surpassed even the extravagant daytime ceremonies that had already captivated the city. Attendants and palace staff had long whispered about preparations that involved music instruments, finely embroidered costumes, and carefully trained animals, all moving in precise sequences meant to inspire both awe and obedience. The fragmentary records suggested that the emperor intended to bring together the most influential men in Rome, along with the animals that had been elevated to near sacred status, in order to create a performance in which human and divine presence would coexist in a single orchestrated moment. Citizens who heard stories about the event imagined lanterns flickering along marble corridors, music echoing through the city, and animals moving with the dignity of courtiers, and the spectacle captured the imagination of generations long after the event had failed to materialize. Elagabalus's attention to the smallest detail in both public and private ceremonies reinforced the sense that his reign was meticulously designed around spectacle and ritual. Attendants described the painstaking care he took to ensure that every animal was groomed, every instrument placed, and every garment arranged with an exactness that combined devotion with whim. Guests were instructed to observe silently, to internalize lessons about hierarchy, decorum, and the blending of absurdity and authority. It is remarkable to consider that a teenager could orchestrate events of such complexity, and that the social hierarchy of Rome could bend to accommodate both the whims of a ruler and the precision of ceremonial choreography. Observers often noted that participating in these rituals required a delicate balance of attentiveness, patience, and willingness to embrace the surreal. The emperor's taste for gifts and symbols of power continued to manifest in ways that were both entertaining and challenging to interpret. Attendants reported elaborate offerings that combined precious metals, rare fabrics, and symbolic animals in arrangements that required careful study to understand. Senators and courtiers who received these gifts had to interpret the intended message correctly or risk losing favor in subtle but impactful ways. It was as if the emperor had created an entire ecosystem of power in which observation, interpretation, and participation were equally important, and in which whim and authority were inseparable. The lessons of these interactions extended beyond the palace because stories of the gifts and ceremonies spread into the city, creating a culture in which spectacle and authority were intertwined. Even the personal habits of Elagabalus contributed to the unusual character of his reign. Observers noted that he often spent hours in quiet contemplation, watching the behavior of animals or considering the layout of ceremonial spaces. These private moments suggested a depth of reflection that contrasted with the exuberance of his public rituals. Attendants who witnessed these periods of concentration described the emperor as both meticulous and thoughtful, as if he were preparing not just for ceremonies but for an ongoing performance in which his legacy would be defined as much by the precision of his planning as by the extravagance of his actions. In this way, the reign combined whim and calculation in a manner that was both baffling and compelling. The surviving senators remained acutely aware of the influence of Elagabalus even after his death because their experiences with humiliation and ritual had left lasting impressions on their conduct and expectations. Those who had survived the arena or public ceremonies developed skills in observation, subtlety, and diplomacy that were crucial to navigating the continued complexities of Roman politics. They learned to anticipate outcomes based on careful reading of both gestures and symbols and the lessons of obedience, mixed with discreet judgment, became part of the fabric of political life. In a sense, the absurdity of the emperor's reign created a school for survival in which imagination and attention were as important as formal training or authority. Stories about the emperor's fascination with animals continued to captivate citizens and scholars alike. Incitatus remained the most famous example, but records suggested that many other creatures were trained and elevated to positions of ceremonial significance. Attendants recalled the precise movements required during events, and the silent attention demanded from both human and animal participants. Scholars later interpreted these practices as a form of symbolic governance, in which order and obedience were taught through ritual spectacle rather than written law or command. Citizens who witnessed even glimpses of these events described a combination of awe and bemusement, and the tales of animals as honorary participants persisted in popular memory. Meanwhile, rumors persisted that the emperor had considered even more ambitious ceremonies that would have involved combinations of music, dance, ritual, and symbolic acts of homage that surpassed anything previously attempted. These speculations fascinated both contemporary and later observers because they hinted at a creativity that was limitless and an imagination that could extend authority through spectacle in ways previously unimagined. Attendants and courtiers often reflected on the pressures of participation in these ceremonies and the constant attention required to navigate a world in which the emperor's whims and divine gestures intertwined. The lessons learned were subtle but profound and extended beyond the palace into the broader culture of the city. And then, just when it seemed that every possible document and story had been accounted for, another account surfaced describing a ritual so bizarre that it seemed almost invented. The text suggested that the emperor had planned to combine multiple ceremonial acts simultaneously, including the placement of animals in symbolic positions, the orchestration of music and dance, and the subtle manipulation of lighting to create effects that would inspire both reverence and astonishment. The document ended abruptly, as if interrupted, and left a tantalizing question about what might have been. Scholars and citizens alike were left to imagine the event, and the very possibility that such an act could have taken place added yet another layer to the ongoing fascination with a teenager who had transformed power into theater and whim. The tantalizing mystery of the incomplete ritual lingered in the imagination of both scholars and citizens because it suggested an ambition that surpassed ordinary understanding and hinted at a teenager who had sought to transform every aspect of authority into performance and spectacle. Observers imagined the carefully trained animals poised in symbolic positions, the corridors lit with soft flickering lights, and the echo of music perfectly timed to the gestures of both humans and beasts. Senators and attendants alike would have been required to navigate this choreography with attention and subtlety, demonstrating loyalty while simultaneously understanding the humor and absurdity embedded in every movement. The fragmentary records left enough detail to fascinate, but too little to fully comprehend, and the unknown became a stage on which speculation thrived. Elagabalus' approach to ceremony and ritual reflected a combination of meticulous planning and spontaneous whim that kept all who participated in suspense and quiet tension. Attendants remembered mornings when they were instructed to prepare elaborate arrangements and afternoons when plans would be altered without explanation. Guests were often unsure whether to observe solemnly or to recognize the playful undertones of the event, and part of the genius of the emperor's approach was that no one could ever fully predict his intentions. The palace became a theater in which observation, interpretation, and participation were all essential to survival, and the lessons learned about authority, obedience, and creativity were both subtle and enduring. The emperor's fascination with animals continued to define the unique character of his reign. Incitatus retained a prominent role in ceremonial events, while other creatures were elevated to symbolic status in ways that blurred the line between ritual and governance. Attendants learned to anticipate the precise timing and movements of each animal and to recognize gestures that conveyed meaning both practical and symbolic. Scholars later described these practices as a form of social education in which observation and comprehension became integral to the exercise of authority, and where even the most seemingly absurd actions contributed to the underlying structure of governance. Citizens who caught glimpses of these displays often described a mixture of admiration, confusion, and slight fear, as if the boundaries between the ordinary and the divine had been subtly dissolved. Meanwhile, senators continued to navigate the delicate aftermath of humiliation and spectacle. Those who had survived the arena or the ceremonial trials developed skills of diplomacy, subtlety, and attention that were unmatched in ordinary political life. Observers noted that they learned to read gestures, clothing, and expressions as carefully as they interpreted written law, and that the ability to anticipate the whims of authority became a central aspect of power. In this way, the absurdity of the emperor's reign provided an education in both human psychology and the performative aspects of leadership that extended far beyond the palace walls. The influence of these lessons could be felt in the social behavior of the city for years after the emperor's death, and in the strategies of politicians attempting to balance respect with survival. Stories of the emperor's extravagance traveled into the streets of Rome, where ordinary citizens marveled at accounts of ritual animals, exotic gifts, and elaborate processions. These stories were often softened for bedtime or entertainment, but retained a faint edge of tension, reminding listeners that power could be both whimsical and absolute. Children learned to anticipate unpredictability, and adults adjusted expectations of authority and decorum in subtle ways. In these narratives, the emperor became larger than life, not because of conquest or legislation, but because of imagination, whim, and the ability to orchestrate reality according to a personal vision that challenged conventional understanding. Elagabalus's personal habits also contributed to the enduring fascination with his life. Observers noted hours spent in reflection, studying the behavior of animals, contemplating ceremonial layouts, or writing notes that combined philosophy and ritual. These private moments revealed a depth that contrasted sharply with the exuberance of public spectacle, and suggested that behind the whimsy there was careful thought and deliberate planning. Attendants remarked on the precision with which he prepared for even the most extravagant events, and on the way he balanced authority and amusement in ways that created both fascination and mild anxiety for participants. The emperor's distribution of gifts remained both playful and instructive. Precious metals, rare fabrics, and symbolic animals were combined into elaborate offerings that required interpretation and understanding. Recipients had to perceive the meaning correctly or risk social disfavor, and in this way whim became a subtle tool of influence. Citizens who heard stories about these gifts observed how performance and authority intertwined, and how the lessons of interpretation, patience, and observation extended beyond the palace into broader culture. The system created a network of influence in which perception was as important as obedience, and imagination became a form of currency for those participating in the rituals. And then one of the most remarkable discoveries emerged from the archives, describing a planned nocturnal ceremony in which music, dance, animals, and symbolic gestures were to be combined into a performance of unprecedented scale. The account ended abruptly, leaving a tantalizing question about what might have occurred. Scholars and citizens alike imagined lanterns flickering across marble floors, the gentle movement of animals, the rustle of robes, and the echo of perfectly timed music. The unknown details of the ritual ensured that even after the emperor's death, his imagination continued to shape perceptions of authority, spectacle, and the subtle art of controlling both human and animal participants in a carefully orchestrated theater of power. The fragmentary accounts of the nocturnal ceremony became one of the most discussed mysteries of the reign because they suggested a level of planning and imagination that seemed almost impossible for a teenager. Scholars speculated endlessly about the intended choreography, the placement of animals, and the symbolic meaning of gestures that were hinted at in incomplete letters. It was clear that the emperor's ambition was to create an event in which reality and ritual would merge so completely that participants would struggle to distinguish between obedience, amusement, and awe. Attendants remembered whispered instructions for months in advance in preparation that involved precise timing of music, lighting, and ceremonial positioning that was as exhausting to execute as it was mesmerizing to witness. Citizens who heard these accounts marveled at the audacity and imagination required, and the story became a quiet obsession for those who wished to understand the mind of a ruler who had transformed whim into governance. Even without the completed ceremony, the emperor's influence continued to ripple through the city. Senators who had survived both humiliation and arena spectacles had become masters of subtle observation and diplomacy. They learned to anticipate the intentions of authority figures, to interpret gestures and symbols, and to navigate the complex hierarchy created by Elagabalus with skill and care. These lessons extended beyond politics into daily life as observers adjusted behavior to accommodate both expectation and surprise. In this way, the absurdity and whim of the emperor created a long-lasting education in human behavior, attention, and patience that endured long after his brief reign ended. Elagabalus's fascination with animals continued to define both ceremonial and personal life in the palace. Incitatus remained central to ritual events, and other animals were incorporated into symbolic displays of loyalty, reverence, and power. Attendants developed an intimate knowledge of animal behavior and subtle cues as these creatures became co-participants in both spectacle and governance. Scholars later described this as an early form of performative authority in which obedience and observation were inseparable, and where even the most absurd elements contributed to the structure and culture of power. Citizens who witnessed glimpses of these events described a mixture of awe, confusion, and mild apprehension, as the palace seemed to operate according to its own internal logic, dictated by whim, imagination, and careful planning. The emperor's personal routines reinforced the sense of both calculation and unpredictability. He often spent long hours in reflection observing animals, the movement of ceremonial objects, and the rhythms of music used in rituals. These private moments suggested a thoughtful and deliberate approach beneath the flamboyant public persona and gave attendants a sense that even the most extravagant acts were part of a considered strategy. Guests noted the precision with which every object was arranged, and the attention paid to small details in both presentation and timing. In this way, Elagabalus combined authority, whim, and legacy in a manner that was both baffling and compelling, leaving all who participated in events with a mixture of admiration and mild anxiety. Even ordinary citizens were affected by the continuing stories of spectacle and ritual. Tales of animals elevated to ceremonial importance, exotic gifts, and elaborate processions spread through the city and inspired awe, amusement, and occasional fear. Children were fascinated by accounts of dancing animals and glowing lights, while adults learned to appreciate the subtle lessons of observation and adaptability implicit in the emperor's approach to authority. In this way, the imagination and whim of a single teenager reshaped both expectation and behavior across the entire city, creating a culture in which spectacle became inseparable from power and in which attention and interpretation were as vital as obedience. The emperor's gifts continued to fascinate historians and citizens alike. Objects of precious metal, rare fabrics, and symbolic animals required careful observation and interpretation. Recipients who failed to recognize the significance of these gifts risked subtle social disfavor, and in this way whim became a tool of influence and education. The palace operated as a carefully orchestrated ecosystem in which human and animal participants were taught to navigate a world defined simultaneously by authority and absurdity. Stories of these gifts and the lessons embedded within them spread beyond the palace walls, ensuring that even ordinary observers were shaped by the imagination and precision of Elagabalus's reign. And then the fragment of the final ceremony remained the most tantalizing clue of all. Its abrupt ending left scholars and citizens alike imagining lanterns flickering along marble corridors, animals positioned in ritual alignment, robes rustling, and music echoing perfectly in time with ceremonial gestures. The unknown details of the event ensured that even after the emperor's death, his creative vision continued to influence perceptions of authority, spectacle, and human behavior. Attendants recalled whispered stories of preparation months in advance of the intended event, and citizens marveled at the very idea that such a performance had been conceived, leaving a sense that history itself had been momentarily transformed by whim, imagination, and meticulous planning. The abrupt ending of the final ceremonial fragment left a lingering sense of mystery over the reign of Elagabalus, because it suggested plans that were never executed and possibilities that were never realized. Scholars and citizens alike imagined the lanterns flickering across marble corridors, the subtle placement of animals, and the echoing music timed perfectly to movements of both humans and beasts. Even without execution, the thought of such a spectacle captured imaginations and reinforced the idea that the emperor's creativity and whim had no bounds. In every corner of Rome, stories circulated quietly about the absurdity and elegance of the reign, about animals elevated to ceremonial importance, and about the subtle lessons embedded in both spectacle and obedience. Attendants remembered the anticipation in the palace during the months leading up to the intended event, and the careful attention required to prepare for a ceremony of such scale. They rehearsed the movement of animals and objects, practiced gestures and timing of music and lights, and observed countless rules that could change without notice. Even small missteps were noticed and often quietly corrected, and the experience created a disciplined community trained to navigate both whim and authority. The emperor's genius was that he could teach lessons about observation, patience, and flexibility without ever appearing to lecture, and the lessons became ingrained in both memory and behavior. The influence of the emperor extended far beyond ceremonial routines because senators and attendants carried the lessons of subtlety and careful observation into every aspect of governance. Those who survived humiliation and spectacle became skilled interpreters of gesture and symbol, navigating a complex hierarchy shaped by both authority and whim. These lessons became part of the cultural fabric of the city as stories spread into ordinary life, and the imagination of citizens was shaped by accounts of ceremonial animals, extravagant gifts, and unpredictable spectacle. In this way, the legacy of Elagabalus extended beyond his brief reign into the behavior, expectations, and imaginations of the population. The emperor's attention to animals remained one of the defining features of his unique approach to power. Incitatus continued to occupy a central place in ceremonial events, and other animals were incorporated into elaborate symbolic arrangements. Attendants learned to interpret every subtle movement and gesture, and to respond with precision to the needs of both emperor and animal. Scholars later described this as a form of performative authority in which obedience, observation, and imagination were inseparable. Citizens who witnessed glimpses of these events described awe, confusion, and subtle apprehension because the palace operated according to a logic that was entirely its own and that combined whim, ritual, and authority in a manner that challenged conventional understanding. The emperor's personal habits revealed a surprising depth that contrasted with public extravagance. He spent hours observing animals, studying ceremonial arrangements, and contemplating the timing of music and gestures. These moments of reflection suggested a careful and deliberate mind capable of orchestrating complex events while maintaining an aura of whimsy and unpredictability. Attendants observed that even the most elaborate spectacles were underpinned by precise planning, and that the emperor's imagination was paired with meticulous attention to detail. It was a balance of whim, calculation, and reflection that ensured his authority remained absolute while his creativity remained unbounded. Even ordinary citizens were shaped by the stories of the emperor's reign. Tales of animals elevated to symbolic importance, of lavish gifts, and of bizarre ceremonies spread quietly through markets, workshops, and homes. Children listened with wide-eyed wonder while adults absorbed subtle lessons about attention, patience, and interpretation. In this way, imagination became a part of daily life, and authority was recognized not just in law but in performance, spectacle, and the anticipation of the unexpected. The reign of Elagabalus transformed the city subtly, leaving traces of whim, creativity, and the careful orchestration of human and animal behavior in everyday thought and conversation. The emperor's gifts continued to fascinate those who received them and those who studied them. Precious metals, fabrics, and animals were arranged to convey messages that required interpretation. Misreading the significance could result in social disadvantage or loss of favor. In this way, whim became a mechanism of influence, observation a form of survival, and imagination a currency for participating in the complex ecosystem of palace authority. The blending of spectacle, education, and governance ensured that the lessons of the reign endured long after the emperor's brief life ended. And finally, the fragment of the nocturnal procession remained the most enduring symbol of the reign. Its abrupt ending left historians and citizens imagining a performance of light, movement, music, and symbolism orchestrated to perfection but never realized. The unknown details allowed the imagination to roam freely and reinforced the idea that Elagabalus had transformed authority, whim, and spectacle into a singular vision of power. In the quiet of the palace and in the minds of those who studied it, the rustle of robes, the flicker of lanterns, and the silent gestures of animals continued to echo across time. It became clear that even a brief reign of 18 years could leave an indelible mark on history through creativity, meticulous planning, and a willingness to imagine the impossible. And so the story ends not with a completed spectacle, but with the enduring shadow of imagination, whim, and the audacity of a teenager who made the palace a theater, the animals honorary participants, and the city itself a silent witness to a vision that no one could fully contain or forget. The corridors remain empty, but if one listens carefully, the faint echoes of music, ritual, and rustling robes whisper the tale of a reign that defied convention and reshaped the very understanding of power. Imagine a teenage emperor so reckless and whimsical that he crowned his horse pope, forced senators to bow to it, and orchestrated bizarre ceremonies where animals became honorary participants in Rome's politics. Elagabalus lived fast, ruled unpredictably, and transformed the palace into a stage of absurdity, spectacle, and quiet genius. Every ritual, every gift, and every eccentric act left a mark on the city and its people, blending whim, authority, and imagination in ways history has never forgotten. His story is tragic, fascinating, and hauntingly unforgettable. If you want to drift into the strange, dark, and mesmerizing world of history like this, subscribe to Stories Before Sleep and let us carry you through the untold tales of the past, one whispered story at a time.